Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Skinwalkers and Other Beasties, Volume 1, Story 1. I don't consider myself to be a particularly superstitious person. That is to say, I get the occasional kick out of the horoscope, and my boyfriend and I like to humor the idea that spirits and poltergeists exist. We even joke about how we'd haunt people when we died and came back as ghosts. In fact, my boyfriend refuses to go anywhere near a Ouija board. Refuses to even think of it. Why even tempt it, he'd say. Why would you want to taunt evil ghosts like that? Ghosts never play fair. If you piss one off, you're screwed. I don't think he was ever serious. Just precautionary. But maybe he was right. God, this all happened so recently. I'm still shaken. Can barely write or talk about it. Now without my nerves acting up. Okay, here it goes. A few weeks ago, my mom, sister, and I went to Colorado for an entire week of vacation. We were going to drive all over the state, visit the national parks, and go horseback riding and whitewater rafting, so much more. I was excited, and I sorely needed a break from work anyway. We drove a grueling 16 hours out there and spent our first day rafting down the rivers. After an extremely wet but exhilarating day, we drove out to a ranch house to go horseback riding. We arrived at sunset, so it was too late to do anything, but we had all next day to ride the trails and see the sights. The ranch was dumpy, to put it nicely. It was all run down with scraps of steel everywhere, and the shoddy lodging cabins were in desperate need for repair. I swear the roof over our shack of a cabin was a giant piece of drywall with shingles stapled to the top. My sister and I thoroughly checked the place for spiders and bugs before we even thought of bringing our luggage inside. It was only for one night, I reassured myself. Just one night in a dumpy shack on a rock-hard bed that probably had bed bugs under the sheets. I shuddered at the thought. My mom tried to cheer us up. She had brought skewers and a pack of hot dogs to roast over the communal fire pit. Happy to get out of the shack, my sister and I made a nice cozy fire, and soon a few of the visitors came out to sit around the fire and roast s'mores and share stories. We talked about where we were from, where we were going, and all our adventures along the way. Pretty soon the stories turned into tall tales and urban legends and the sort of stuff you'd usually tell around a bonfire. That's when I spoke up. I love stories, especially scary ones. And hey, we're out west. We're Native American territory. Why not liven the place up with my favorite local myth, the legend of the Skinwalkers? Now, for the uninitiated, Skinwalkers are very evil, very dangerous beings. They were humans who gained the ability to take on the form of an animal by wearing its pelt, usually through very dark and taboo magic. I knew all this and told my story. Who doesn't love a good ghost story, after all? Everyone seemed to be enjoying it. I admit, I took some creative liberties, really just retold an old werewolf story, but with a skinwalker as the monster instead. I improvised a lot of the story and added a few things that weren't in the mythos at all. I gave our beloved frightening skinwalker wide, crazed eyes with pinpoints for pupils with a matching insane smile. I made the skinwalker horribly misshapen, swollen joints and arms that were too long and legs that were too short, and a head that never sat straight on its shoulders. I made it as terrifying as I could imagine. No one minded. They actually really liked it. A man from Kentucky admitted that the visuals alone were enough to creep him out. Victory in my book, if you ask me. And once I was done, everyone decided it was getting really late. Our firewood was dwindling, and it was as good a time as any to turn in for the night. We packed up our skewers and s'mores, doused the fire, and headed to our little shacks. I tossed and turned a lot, trying to fall asleep. I couldn't get comfortable in that damn bed. A rock was probably cozier than that mattress. So against my better judgment, I got out of bed and walked about the cabin. I reasoned that if I stayed up late enough, I'd be so tired that I would fall asleep no matter what I was laying on. I think I briefly contemplated sleeping on the floor. I wasn't that desperate yet. It was pitch black outside. No lights from any nearby street lamps, no car headlights. Hell, not even the cabin lights were on, and I don't remember seeing a single star. It was a bit creepy, but I shrugged off the shiver creeping up my back as I simply felt the cold tile beneath my feet. I did, however, find it odd there weren't any lights on at all over the entire property. You'd think there'd be a floodlight on the horse stables or in the main office, but no, nothing. That was really weird. I stepped outside in my flimsy flip-flops to get a better look. I could barely make out the ranch, and for some stupid reason, I decided to go walking around. Eventually, my eyes adjusted where I could see well enough to navigate. I paced up and down the road where the cabin sat, and then circled around to the fenced-in field where the horses were out of grazing. Except there weren't any horses. Probably in the stables for the night, I reasoned. I shivered again. It was getting cold. I turned around to head back to my own cabin. It was stupid of me to be out all alone at an obscene hour. I now realized I needed to get to bed. But when I turned, there was something in the middle of the road. Its shape was swallowed up by the surrounding darkness. I could barely make it out, but whatever it was tall and thin. I shrugged it off as just a pole or something else and kept walking. But then it moved. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I could barely breathe. I just imagined that, I said. I just imagined it. I'm freaking myself out. Get your effing head straight. It moved again. My paralyzed throat managed to squeak out a pathetically weak whimper as my legs began to lose strength. I shivered violently against the cold that was building up inside of me. My eyes began to focus on the impossibility of a dark figure standing against a barely visible sleet gray night. Now I could see it. It was a person, but like nothing I had ever seen before. Its arms were impossibly long, its legs impossibly short. It had a torso far too long for its real thin body and a head much too big for its pencil-thin neck. Its right arm was sticking out to its side, swinging up and down. Its blockish head rolled onto its left shoulder, jerkily twitched up and down, up and down. It didn't move other than that, just stood there, twitching, arms jerking up and down, head lolling along its shoulder. I still stood there, like the dummy that I was. My cabin was a few hundred yards behind that thing, and I wasn't so stupid as to try to walk past it. My only option was to go around, behind the cabins and the stables, and hope it didn't see me. I forced myself to lift my foot off the ground to step backwards. My flip-flop made a loud, wet smacking sound as it cracked against my foot, and I immediately froze in horror. The thing stopped too. It stood there perfectly straight, perfectly still, listening. I stayed as still as I could. My breath was shallow and panicked, and I tried to force myself to slow my breathing before I started wheezing. My heart thundered in my chest. My whole body was shaking, but I didn't move. Neither did it. I began to slowly, so goddamn slowly, bend over and slip my feet out of those effing flip-flops. My feet touched the dirt and the crumbly gravel, but at least now I could move silently. I spared a quick glance to the side to see where I was going. 2 cabins were immediately to my right. I could slip between them with ease, disappear out of sight. I only looked away for a second. When I turned back, the thing was gone. It was effing gone. It knew I was there. It was coming for me. Oh, yet I still couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move no matter how loud my head screamed, "Run! Run! Run!" I heard something behind me. I turned instinctively, even though I knew better. I still turned around. I was greeted with 2 bulging eyes. Oh God, its eyes. staring at me unblinking with 2 black pinholes for pupils and an insane smile that was stretched far too wide to be anything remotely human. My paralysis broke as I stared at that thing. I ran, crying my eyes out, trying to scream, but a horrible lead weight in my throat silenced me. My feet pounded on the dirt. I stomped over anything in my way. I trampled over a jagged rock, slicing my foot wide open. I ignored the pain. I ignored my body screaming in agony. I ignored my own blood pouring from the wound. I didn't care. I just ran. I felt the cold creeping up my back. Oh God, that cold. It was sinking right into my bones. I couldn't stop shaking or sobbing, and I didn't stop running until I burst into the cabin. I slammed the door shut, then bolted the lock and leaped into my bed. I huddled under the blankets, hiding my head, and there I gasped and shook for breath. And I waited. I didn't sleep that entire night. I was too scared. I couldn't get rid of that chill. All I thought about was that thing standing there and twitching. Finally, morning broke and I allowed breath of release and relief. Whatever I had seen had not come for me, and now that it was light, it could no longer take me by surprise. My mom noticed my bleeding foot and the blood I tracked through the cabin. I shrugged it off, said I cut myself the night before when we were making s'mores. I don't think she believed me, but she didn't push it. We left not long after that, and as we left, I looked at the place where that thing once stood and I shuddered again, but there was nothing. I assured myself there was nothing. We said goodbye to the ranchers and to our companions, and I noticed the man from Kentucky who said he had thoroughly enjoyed my story. He told me again how much he liked it, said he was going to tell it to his own kids when he got home. They really like scary stories, he said, and as we drove away his head rolled onto his left shoulder, and he smiled a wide, insane smile as he waved goodbye. Story number 2. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let the American flag touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him, reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with him so he could show me. He admitted this all in a casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9. I remember giving us plenty of time. It was further away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute Indians didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This apparently was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off to the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing just past a shallow creek with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget, though to many it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush, but suddenly it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer I saw things had been carved in them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around as if they actually had been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned, knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed I was making far too much noise and was doing it far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, weighing off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off, or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny. "Hey, Buck, yeah! You horny mother, leave us alone!" He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge behind a layer of trees pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark," I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark!" I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far. I knew because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed myself. There were other things, too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark!" I called out furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again, "Mark!" Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the tree stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please. I spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head. The head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature, straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized, a mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting it and became animalistic. At the end of its legs were powerful hooves. At the end of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its heads. And one of those claws, Mark's body, was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment, there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I'd never run so fast or so desperately in all my life. But it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going in the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it slightly, but that's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore. But I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up the trail at the point where it went up between 2 mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there near the beginning of the trail was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I wrote the story here. It comes back to me in dreams, nightmares, that creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite, because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood, that old circle left alone for so long, that had been quietly penetrated. Story number 3. I ain't scared of nothing. That's what I yelled to my brother as I slammed the door to my car shed. Things have changed since then. I've changed. I remember his smirk, how he held up my jacket, the way he spouted off an endless list of things I should be scared of. Skinwalkers and witches and werewolves. He presented each one as a reason after reason of why this idea was stupid, saying I still had time to flake out, save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my jacket from his grasp, sliding into my car and yelling that I'm not scared, before speeding away towards the darkening outline of the mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like teeth. Boy, how I wish I'd listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm effing scared. Let me back up a bit. It all started about 2 days ago. I was out of my mind depressed. Could barely get out of bed, thought about chucking myself in front of cars, over bridges, off buildings, just dying. I thought about dying all the time, and enough was enough. One of the few friends I had suggested that I try solo camping, and it said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. He gave me a list of spots, some more isolated than others. I decided on the most isolated one, which was about a 3-hour hike from the last campsite, far out in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. I remember his face, the surprise, the acceptance. You sure? His voice cracked. I nodded, saying nothing. Okay, I mean it. It's a pretty secluded place, especially for a first-time camper. He shrugged. But then again, it's a beautiful spot. It'll definitely give you some perspective. And the night sky out there is insane. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he spoke up again. Hey, don't let the forest spook you, okay? A word of advice from a veteran: don't go out at night, no matter what you hear. You might get totally effed up by a bear or a lion. The drive up the mountains was strangely soothing. The gently curving roads that wove their way through the trees and up in the rocks was exciting to navigate, and soon my mind was eased into a peaceful contemplation. I decided to forego electronics this trip, even going as far as securing my phone in my glove box. I wanted to be completely free of all that shit, able to focus on the now rather than ruminate about the past or fear the future. I would be gone for 5 days and 4 nights, enough time for me to, hopefully, recuperate and reassess my life and what I was doing with it. I soon descended into Estes Park and drove through a picturesque town, willing myself not to stay at the Stanley instead. I found the entrance to the park with ease and continued to the closest lot to my campsite. Night was now falling, and I silently cursed myself for leaving so late. I sat in my car for a good 30 minutes before deciding that it would be too risky hiking 3 hours in near pitch black. There were 4 other tents set up in the lot I was at, with room for one more, and soon I had my own tent set up. That night passed comfortably. I was surrounded by chatting, laughing people and unruly but happy children who ran around and round screaming. A few of them offered me roasted hot dogs and s'mores and beers, and I filled my belly, smiling. I was rolled up in my sleeping bag before the last light from the dying embers faded away. The second night didn't go so smoothly. I woke up late, well rested but still groggy, and took my time repacking my tent. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should just stay there, but at 3 p.m. another family showed up with proof they had reserved the site. So I gathered my things and set off, and immediately got lost. Navigating by map and compass for the first time and alone is a lot harder than it sounds. And the trees can be misleading, can turn you around, make you think you're on the right path when you're really miles from where you're supposed to be. Instead of taking me 3 hours to get to the site, it took me nearly twice that time, and I was swiftly losing what little light was left in the day. Finally, I found the site. But before I breathed a sigh of relief, I haphazardly set up my tent, building a small fire in front of it. It was dark now, and I was jumpy. Every sound I heard was seemingly magnified. Every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire a menace. Spooked, I crawled into the tent and curled up in my bag, trying to will myself to sleep. After a while I was dozing, about to drift off, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a foot crunching outside. My eyes shot open, and I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. I heard the sound again. Someone or something was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like whatever they was was trying to be quiet, stealthy. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts, until I finally decided it was an animal, scavenging for the scraps or inspecting my tent. By dawn, I was dozing again, and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or two, giving myself time to rest up. I woke up disoriented, exhausted, and started to panic before remembering I was out camping and that I needed to start hiking back now. But when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get out of there. But deep down, I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. So I began collecting as much wood as I could to build a big-ass fire and prepared to hunker down for the night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. The third night was, pretty problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down, waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't kosher for camping, but I was improvising and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small, pathetic, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there listening, afraid. Finally I realized I was just being ridiculous, that what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear, that my subconscious, my monkey mind, was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down. And I heard it. Softly at first, a footstep, then 2, 3. Growing louder, bolder, I sat up and felt my eyes increase to the size of saucers and my breath quicken. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking. I was operating purely off of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running and running around and around my tent. Suddenly the side of my tent pushed in as if someone was slapping it from the outside. "Hey!" I yelled, scared out of my wits. "Hey, I'm awake! I'm in here!" I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process and slammed into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with a red-tinted flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away and followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides, their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them and a branch cracked beneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person, and then they turned their head ever so slightly. "Hey," I said again. "What's wrong? What are you doing here?" And it boiled up. A sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, and it echoed around me, rattling around in my skull. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping bag, crying. And the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I fainted. Either way, I woke up the next day to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing, no footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. "Forget this," I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today, in the dark. I wouldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to unpole the tent when I heard it. A sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. Help me, please, oh God, help me." I reacted more out of instinct than logic and began running towards the sound before realizing that I in no way was in a place to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. "Where are you?" I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. "I'm here. Where are you?" Quickly the screams descended into a deep, unsettling laughter. Scared out of my mind, I turned and ran back the way I came. By some miracle, I made it back to my site, grabbed my pack, and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me the mountain loomed up like fangs, like I was about to be swallowed whole by a monstrous mouth. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole out of 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and reeled in horror, too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside, but not just anyone. It was me, sitting there, pallor and bone-thin, a too-wide grin plastered to my face. A single droplet of blood rolled down from each eye, which, instead of having green irises, were totally, woefully black. I jumped back, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled up, I saw my hand, that was not my hand, reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face, that was not my face, looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. I screamed. I stood. I ran. And I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun anymore for guidance since it had almost fully set. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me up, pushing against me, like they were trying to hold me back, hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly, a light flashed in my face, and I ran into something solid, something black, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Shit. Oh, please, God, no, no, no. I heard my voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down. It's okay. You just scared me. Calm down. What's wrong? I looked up and into the worried gray eyes of a human face, the face of a middle-aged man, to be exact. He was holding me up. The flashlight he was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing, only trees swinging slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, he said again, was that you screaming? I came out here to check. I couldn't speak. I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? Yes, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded, then began crying. Hey, it's okay. It can be spooky out here. Come on, my car's right over there. He gestured with his head back behind him. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? He glanced at me, then away. I'm a park ranger, but he didn't look like one. He was wearing a smooth black suit, black tie, and white shirt, and his shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. Come on, he said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto his back. As he did so, his jacket flapped slightly, and I saw what looked like a Sig Sauer handgun strapped to his belt. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? He shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing, and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. He popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. He climbed in the driver's seat and asked me where he should take me. I told him the lot number, and we were on our way. After a few moments, he flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Corn nuts? He asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began chomping away. I licked my fingers, then looked back at him. So, are you really a ranger? He looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at him, transfixed, as he looked exhausted, his wood-colored hair disheveled and dirty from the forest. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop, and the man let out a slow, low breath. His eyes narrowed, and he looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed his gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me, and there in the middle of the road was me. The me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The man looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met his gaze. I don't get paid enough for this shit, the man muttered before slamming his foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body, and the man kept driving, but around us and in between the trees stirred into the darkness, laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. We reached the lot in silence. bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The man beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now dead, crushed by the car, or at least so badly wounded that it would soon succumb. The SUV slowed to a stop and the man popped the trunk and hopped out. He walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. He handed it to me and I took it and thanked him for everything. "No problem," he said. "All in a day's or night's work." His lips quivered as if he was about to smile. I turned to leave, but he spoke again. "Hey," I turned to face him again. "If you ever want to talk about what you, saw or just call me." He held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. Then I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The man was already back in his car. He waved at me, then sped off, back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car, and left, breathing a sigh of relief. I still haven't told anyone about what happened. Even when they asked why I refused to go camping ever again, I just shrug and tell them that it wasn't my thing, that I prefer a warm bed and the bustling sounds of a busy city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call, wondering who the man really was, and if he'd really be able to explain what happened to me.